Who could have foreseen the amount of damage Hurricane Sandy caused in New York City and New Jersey? Well, Mike Tidwell sure did. A half dozen years ago, Tidwell published his book titled The Ravaging Tide, Strange Weather, Future Katrinas, and the Coming Death of America's Coastal Cities. Mike is the founder and director of the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, a grassroots nonprofit dedicated to raising awareness about global warming in Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. He's also a filmmaker and an award-winning environmentalist. Mike Tidwell, welcome to Radio Ecoshock.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, when you published The Ravaging Tide, what did you say could happen to New York City?
You know, anyone who looks at a map and sees the geographic features of New York Harbor and Manhattan is made quickly aware of the fact that if a big surge tide from a hurricane were to enter that New York Harbor and surrounding areas, there's nowhere for the water to go but up. You know, basically New York Harbor and the East River and Hudson River form a kind of catchment for water, and once that water gets in there, literally there's nowhere for it to spread out. There are no vast wetlands, interior wetlands, or flat areas, and the only place for the water to go is up, which is why New York is in many ways a basket case waiting to happen. And when I wrote my book in 2006 after Katrina, you know, many of us concerned about climate change, you know, lifted our gaze to say, well, if this kind of disaster can happen in New Orleans, where else might it happen from, you know, the combination of sea level rise and rising sea surface temperatures that provide the fuel for hurricanes? If a really big hurricane hit elsewhere in the United States, where might the most damage be caused? And New York just, jumped out at me during my research. And that's why I basically, in my 2006 book, described pretty much everything we've seen the last week. In fact, the paperback version of that book, also that came out in 2006, has an illustration of Manhattan with water pouring into it in a really sort of spooky, foreshadowing way. So I guess it's just, you know, anyone who's out of denial about climate change and is looking at the real reality of sea level rise and bigger storms, you know, was very clear that New York was vulnerable, and even Mayor Michael Bloomberg was warning about these impacts potentially happening.
And how was your book received? Did people believe it or criticize or just ignore it?
Well, the book was published by Free Press, and it got good reviews, but, there's that whole people not wanting to hear bad news, and change is difficult for people. And I have a friend who's told me, please stop writing books, because in 2003, I wrote another book called Bayou Farewell that predicted the Katrina hurricane disaster. Literally, the subtitle of that 2003 book was The Rich Life and Tragic Death of Louisiana's Cajun Coast, again published in 2003, 2 years before the Katrina disaster, because that disaster was obvious to anyone paying attention as well, because of the poor levees, the rising ocean levels, the disappearing wetlands and barrier islands. Katrina was a disaster foretold by many journalists and activists like myself for many years before it came. But even in that book was not well received before it came out, warning about a potential Katrina. And the 2006 book, The Ravaging Tide, again, good reviews, but this country is kind of slow to let in the reality of climate change, and as a result, we're delaying solutions so long that we're entering a period of consequences, serious consequences, and that's I think what we've seen with Hurricane Sandy. You know, we all hope that we can respond fast enough and get off of carbon fuels fast enough this century to prevent the worst impacts of global warming. But you have to wonder, what is it going to take? And is it going to take Katrina 2, 3, and 4 and Sandy 5, 6, and 7? I don't know. I hope not.
Well, in a recent press conference, you explained a new concept that everybody needs to grasp after Hurricane Sandy, and I'm talking about that continual line in scientific circles and echoed by the press that says you can never blame a single storm like Sandy on climate change. What do you say to that?
Well, the real answer to that question, did global warming cause Sandy? The real answer is yes, absolutely. And how can someone say with certainty that global warming caused Sandy when we've been told over and over again that you can't tie any single weather event to global warming? The reason you can say with certainty that global warming caused Sandy is because we've changed the great ecological systems of this planet. Nobody can deny that we are already seeing sea level rise. We've had about a foot of sea level rise worldwide in the last 100 years, attributed almost entirely to global warming. When you melt the land-based glaciers, the oceans rise. When you heat the oceans, in terms of temperature, the water expands, and those two factors together cause sea level rise. So we know sea level rise is happening. There's no controversy there. You can measure it. It is a fact. We also know that we've increased moisture in the atmosphere because of global warming. The warmer the planet is, the more evaporation occurs over oceans, and the more moisture is in the atmosphere. So that's number two. We know there's been a 5% increase in moisture in the global atmosphere just since the 1970s. And then on top of that, we know we've raised the sea surface temperatures of the world's oceans, including the Atlantic Ocean. Those are all not disputable. Those are facts. More moisture, you can measure it, higher ocean temperatures, and more sea level rise. So we've systemically changed the planet already. And systemically, those are the main drivers of Hurricane Sandy: warm water, sea level rise, and more moisture in the atmosphere. So systemically, we clearly made Sandy the monster that she was because we've changed these systems. And when you look at it from that perspective, in terms of systemic causation, then it's clear that the fingerprints of climate change are all over this hurricane, undeniably.
This is Radio Ecoshock. I'm Alex Smith. Our guest is Mike Tidwell, director of the Chesapeake Climate Action Network and author of the book The Ravaging Tide, Strange Weather, Future Katrinas, and the Coming Death of America's Coastal Cities. Well, Mike, talking about the coming death of America's coastal cities is pretty provocative. Is there really a possibility we'll have to abandon some coastal cities?
Well, you know, my publisher, Free Press, came up with that depressing title, The Ravaging Tide, Strange Weather, Future Katrinas, and the Coming Death of America's Coastal Cities. You know, most people want to reach for the razor blades when they hear that title, but the intent of the publisher was to really try to shock readers into understanding that these are the kind of things that will happen unless we take action. If we do take action to switch to clean, renewable energy as fast as we can, our leading climate scientists worldwide say that we can probably avoid the worst impacts of global climate change. And by worst impacts, I mean, you know, not just 1 or 2 or 3 feet of sea level rise, but up to 30 feet of sea level rise if the Greenland ice sheet disappears. We can't adapt to that. We would have to abandon coastal cities if we got 30 feet of sea level rise by the end of this century. The worst impacts also include just the kind of catastrophic droughts on a regular scale that we've seen in North America this past year, the kind of growing size of storms and all these impacts together. That's what a world of 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees more warming. We can't go there. We do have to do some adaptation. I mean, we have some more warming in the bank no matter what we do, because carbon dioxide lingers in the atmosphere for up to a century after you release it from the combustion of fossil fuels. So there's a momentum toward more warming and more ocean rise no matter what we do, but it's still more in the adaptable range. And so what we need to do is start to adapt to the warming we can't prevent, and we need to prevent the warming that we can't adapt to. You know, 1 or 2 more degrees of warming, we're going to have to build floodgates for New York City. We're going to have to build levees for many of our coastal cities. But there's a reasonable chance that we can still inhabit these coastal areas. However, if we get to 3 or 4 or 5 degrees of warming and the Greenland ice sheet disappears, then we will see the death of most of our coastal cities just because they won't be habitable. You're not going to be able to live in areas that are perpetually in flood state, perpetually pelted by rain and threatened by high winds. And so it is a very real threat. I think that Hurricane Sandy is a curtain raiser. I think that Mayor Michael Bloomberg had it right this past week when he said, we have old infrastructure in New York and we have a new reality in terms of weather. And what he meant by that was, one, we have to confront climate change. We have to acknowledge that it's real. It's one of the reasons Michael Bloomberg gave for endorsing President Obama for the presidency. And we also, the mayor is realistic to acknowledge, need to adapt to much of it as well. And that's a scary new world that we're entering. You know, the idea of major floodgates for New York City and levees in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, sort of the New Orleansization of many of our coastal cities, you know, sort of committing to the New Orleans model of living below sea level behind levees is a scary prospect, but one that we're going to have to embrace at some level to adapt to the global warming that's already happening.
Well, and hopefully the people of America, the people who are getting washed out and having such severe damage and always having to clean up and rebuild and losing their homes and even losing their loved ones, they're going to put some pressure on the politicians and say, look, this is really happening, do something.
I think you're seeing more of that. I think that, you know, having the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, mention climate change repeatedly in the aftermath of Sandy, the mayor of New York City, a political independent, mentioning climate change, you know, as a core problem. You have the Bloomberg Business Week magazine on its cover this week. It said in very large letters, it's global warming stupid, playing on the Bill Clinton phrase in early 90s of it's the economy stupid. And the executive editor of Bloomberg Business Week tweeted out this week that magazine cover about global warming is only controversial to stupid people. To people who are informed and paying attention, there's no controversy. We see it outside our front door. We see it every day. We see it monthly as the power continues to go out. And I think that polling in the United States shows that more and more Americans are noticing extreme weather, are linking it to climate change, and more want something to be done about it. But the big challenge, again, is going up against the money, the oceans of money, as you mentioned, of Exxon Mobil and the natural gas companies pouring it into our political system, you know, buying the silence of many politicians. But there just comes a point where it just can't be ignored politically any further.